My name is Richard Little. I'm the director of the Keston Institute for Public Finance and Infrastructure Policy here at USC. Starting immediately on your right is Charisma Acey from Ohio State University, where she's an assistant professor of city and regional planning. She works in international development on mapping geographic differences in resources and opportunities at the regional scale. She's done work on household access to potable water in Lagos and Benin City, Nigeria. And currently her research focuses on international community development, poverty alleviation, and human environmental interaction. Immediately to her right is Randy Crane, who's professor of urban planning at UCLA. He studies, well, Randy studies pretty much everything. Housing, transportation, and economic development challenges of cities, focusing on things such as rushed urbanization, urban design, behavioral linkages, urban environmental problem, public finances, housing and transportation geographics. He's got quite an extensive resume in international policy work, including China, Colombia, Guyana, Indonesia, Kenya, Thailand, and Yemen. And he had a Fulbright professorship at the Colegio de Mexico in Mexico City. I had to say that. That's about as much Spanish as I can pronounce. Immediately to his right is J.R. Shazo, also at UCLA. He's a professor of public policy. He's an expert in economics, public finance, and organizational government. He directs the UCLA Luskin Center for Innovation. And last but not least, at the end is George Chen from LADWP, where he's the rates manager and is responsible for implementation of the first base rate increase and rates restructuring since 1993. So while the other members of the panel study this, George actually gets tasked with doing it and putting a smiley face on it for everyone. So, without further ado, let's get underway, and I'm going to sit down so I can make this homey. So is this working? Okay. Well, to kick off the first question, and I'll just throw this out, one of the things that we hear a lot about, and matter of fact, there's been a UN Human Rights Commission activity to actually study access to water. And the role, one of the things they're looking at is the role of the private sector. Is water, because it's so basic to human existence, is it too important to price? And I'll just throw it out to whoever wants to step up first. Don't be shy.
Well, let me just say I've worked on water pricing in developing countries as well, in Honduras and throughout parts of Africa and South Asia. I think water is too important not to price. I think the question that governments and communities have to decide for the lower income households is what mode of provision they're going to rely upon. And if the public sector fails to provide them with water, they're going to purchase it from vendors at prices that are typically 2 to 3 to 4 to 5 times the price that a public system that was reliably financed could provide them with.
Let me just follow on that with, I mean, my experience is the same in these countries where access to water is a problem among the poor, which is that a public pricing strategy that tries to subsidize or keep water as free as possible very much does backfire in many of those instances. But more than that, there's a political economy to the rhetoric that people use, and I think that probably is somewhat true in the United States as well. But in Mexico in particular, I remember going down there to talk about this issue, and people from the water sector saying, But it's just wrong to charge the poor for water when the reality was that the poor weren't getting water. And that was a consequence of partly the revenue structure and the pricing structure. And so it was kind of used as a crutch to not charge the middle class and those who were able to pay. So I think the question itself has some other questions embedded in it, because sometimes that kind of rhetoric is used to be pro-poor when in fact it's not, and indeed people know that on some level in some places.
Sure. I'd like to add or follow up on that by saying I think that it's the ideal that is expressed by you shouldn't charge the poor is that everyone has the right to access water. And what we're seeing around the world is people not being able to access clean water, safe water. Some households do, some households are not able to. The reality, which I think Randy was alluding to, is that poor households are not being served by, say, the municipal water supply, but they are paying for water. They are accessing water in some way. So it's more of what the topic of this conference is about, the equity issue, how to price services. In principle, everybody should have access to water. In reality, I don't think people don't expect to pay for water. Even in Nigeria, the poorest communities, in households I've talked to, they pay enormous amounts for water, and they pay market price for water. They'd be willing to pay a fair price for water if it was delivered, if the service was good. So, as was said, there's a lot of questions embedded in that.
Yep, I kind of agree with everybody here that in order for us to, deliver the water to the homes, there's a lot of costs associated, and water security, and also the transportation, and also you have to secure those sources that is very scarce. So there's some costs to deliver the water and also secure the water, and then you also make sure it's clean and all these associated with the water. So there's a price to it. So yes, we have to also make sure take care of the low income people that also has to be afford the water. So there's a lot of issues related to this. And I have my water rates manager here. He's been there 20 years on the water. So I'd like to invite Richard also join us. And maybe we can pull another chair here. We can talk together.
Sure.
Yeah.
You lost something else here, Jay. I don't know what it was. You're falling apart.
Okay. Could I just extend the conversation while Richard's getting set up here? I wanted to just put this in this discussion of water provision to the poor, presumably in other countries, in context. When Africa and parts of Southeast Asia went through in the middle of the last century, the periods of decolonialization and became nations, nearly all of them had as part of their charters promises to the poor to access to free water and free education. And none of them delivered on it. And in large part, it was because there wasn't the financing. As George pointed out, supplying water requires a lot of capital. You have to secure the source, you have to convey the source, you have to clean the source of water, and then you have to deal with wastewater, which is generated from water consumption. And what I think many of us have seen is the promise of providing water, but it's underpriced, so that the quality and quantity decline over time because the utility doesn't have the funds it needs. And I want to point out something that's often overlooked, but that has come up in the paper here in Los Angeles recently, or to the public's attention, which is that one of the perennial problems of water utilities and electrical utilities, especially in developing countries, but we have a local example, is that municipal governments use these utilities as revenue generators. They require transfers from the utility, which has exacerbated the financial problems that many utilities have. And of course, this for DWP, the city relies on DWP in part for its general fund revenues, which is, if you step back and think about that, it's an unusual strategy, and yet it's a very, very pervasive strategy around the world that tends to weaken the financial integrity, or at least provide some uncertainty to the financial integrity of the public water supply. And I think, again, for those of you not familiar with this, we're all going to talk about public supply versus market supplied rates, because most people in developing countries rely on market solutions, on vendors, to provide them with water. In Haiti, the average Haitian gets almost 100% of their water from private vendors and spends somewhere between 8 and 12% of their income on that water during the dry seasons. It's not, if it were publicly provided, it'd be a third that cost, perhaps.
Let me just have a couple of follow-up clarifying points. One is that this point that many of the poor in these developing nations, particularly the urban poor, get their water through the private sector is not always obvious. And in fact, Haiti, I think, was one of the instances where this was sort of unknown to the public utility. There is a public utility, they do provide water, but what happens is that the water is resold and resold in order to get to the poor because it doesn't get to them directly. So, which involves more labor costs. And the principal problem in the countries I've worked in, particularly Indonesia, where this is a main way of getting water to the poor, is that the vendors, of course, have to add in their labor costs, which is what is responsible for the prices ended up being so high. The World Bank at different points has been worried about corruption or collusion among vendors and price setting, which are legitimate concerns, but at the end of the day, the mechanisms that the private sector uses to get water to the poor increases costs, which is a reason why public provision is so much usually preferred on the cost side of things, and rates that would support that. Another point I want to make kind of gets to the background of your question, I think, in a way, which is that water is a different kind of good. People think of it differently than they do of bread or milk or transportation even. It's something, I know in Mexico there was always this notion that water comes from God, you know, so you can't charge for it. I mean, how can someone take a profit on that or somehow use some mechanism to allocate it that way? And you know, that's a big cultural obstacle sometimes to pricing. Just this notion that this is a commodity that somehow should be provided free, particularly to the poor. And I guess a third follow-up point is that in many cases we, in fact, might favor a system where the poor don't have to pay. But the reality is that that normally what happens is that there aren't the cross-subsidies, so that when the poor don't have to pay, that means other levels of income don't have to pay as well. And so there isn't a revenue stream that permits us to subsidize. But in some cases we might very well, getting to maybe a later question, into a more ideal pricing system, it might be preferable to provide water to the poor, at least at certain levels, at very low cost or no cost. Yeah. But that normally these pricing schemes that are in place are not sophisticated enough to really permit the system to be financed that way.
I would say, you know, one other point here is there are enormous costs to not having clean water available to people, just in terms of additional health care, infant mortality, a lot of social costs associated with that, and you know, really, you know, clean water, and you have different situations too, whether it's you know, urban areas versus villages where maybe, you know, a well that needs to be drilled to get to an available source of clean water, you know, would greatly improve you know, the health and well-being and reduce you know, the costs for you know, the governments have for dealing with that. So that's something that we can't overlook here too. But valuing water, I think, is very important that people understand the value of water, and that we not ignore or camouflage or disregard the fact that, you know, the water is in many parts of the world very expensive to provide.
Well, this is a generally underappreciated aspect of pricing, which is pricing signals to the user the value of water to society. And so in those cases where, particularly for the non-poor, where we subsidize water, we're sending completely the wrong signal to that user about what the value of water is in society, which leads to waste. So that's a problem. But otherwise, I would emphasize that, again, that for the poor, the main problem is public health. And really getting adequate quantities to people to support basic sanitation, really, which leads to, I mean, you know, there are estimates, you maybe might have heard this, but somewhere in the neighborhood of 1 million children die per year, basically from lack of access to adequate quantities of water that lead to certain sanitation problems. So it's a huge public health issue.
Can I add just one point?
Don't be shy.
Okay. I think the question, what should we price water as, assumes that there's a monopoly by the public sector on delivering water. So we can set the price and people will pay it. But as has been mentioned, I call in Nigeria, for example, there's fractured governance in the water sector. So you have the state providing water, they put up the capital to source water from rivers or the groundwater, install the pipes, deliver it through networks throughout the metropolitan area. Some people resell that water. So that's another, even though the state is the source of water, somebody else is delivering the water and is the interface between the customer and the water. And those people who resell water are either doing it legally or illegally. Then you have a whole separate system where people are directly sourcing groundwater, bypassing the entire networks of the state and supplying that water directly to people. So the state is often competing with private sector and even competing with itself in many ways. And so all of that has to be taken into account, the fact that people can get water from other sources before we can even talk about pricing.
Just, I think, to extend this in a direction that we were heading anyway, if you price water, you can then develop a tariff structure that can advantage the poor. You can create a lifeline block rate such that small quantity consumers pay less per unit, and as you consume more, you move up the blocking structure, and you pay more per unit. But without pricing water, you cannot create that rate structure that would cross-subsidize. So have large quantity consumers subsidizing smaller quantity consumers, which tend to be lower-income households or households in multifamily units or dense units. As a point of background, I want to point out that in the U.S., over a third of our water systems use just the opposite tariff structure. They use a decreasing block tariff structure, so that the large consumers are paying less per unit than the small consumers are. So small households might pay twice what a very, very large consumer would pay per unit. And you might ask yourself, how in the world would a tariff structure like that come into being? And then ask yourself, who has the wherewithal to show up on a Tuesday evening at the rate hearings? It's the large consumers who have a real stake in tariff structures that are going to subsidize their consumption of water. So while decreasing block tariffs are predatory in a sense and regressive, so are flat rate and average rate pricing structures for the poor. And that's something that's often overlooked, because a flat rate structure or an average cost structure, you think, well, everyone's paying the same per unit. But that's not true. The big consumers put more cost on the delivery system, because as they grow, the utility has to go out further to get water, has to pump the water further. So the cost they're imposing per unit is higher, but everyone is sharing in that cost. So I think to get us to a rate structure, I would throw out the proposal of an increasing block tariff with a lifeline rate as efficient, fair, and environmentally sound.
Okay, well, that's a good segue to my next question, which was going to be, if you could design any pricing structure for water that you wanted, what features would it have? I mean, perhaps you've already had your shot across the bow. We'll let the others sort of weigh in on that.
Yeah, I would add to the comments just made that there are areas of the country where water is not even metered, and I think you referred to that as a flat rate, but there could be a flat rate in the sense of water being metered and you're charged the same price for whatever quantity of water you use. Metering in Los Angeles really began in the 1920s, and before that, we charged based on the number of fixtures in the house, the number of, if you had a horse, you were charged based on the number of horses. We actually have copies of those old rate ordinances. They're kind of interesting to read, but On the tiering of rates that was mentioned, that water be affordable for the most affordable for the lower quantities, for the essential indoor uses, is important. And then it's also important that you signal the cost of developing new supplies of water, that the tiers convey to the customers the costs of whether it be desalination or recycling, the marginal cost of that next unit of water. We've tried to do that in LA, and of course, you know, as you go on in time, the technologies change, and those things need to be continually looked at.
Maybe I add. Okay. Now, since we talk about rate structure, that there's some issues about from utility perspective that we have fixed costs. So like we have to lay the pipes to your homes, and you know we have to make sure the pipes are working. So we have to reach your meters. We have to bill you every month. So in some cases that you know all the structure that's set that you have a service charge, you have a fixed charge at the upfront. So that may create some problem that you know even though they use very little you know water or energy, but the fixed charge up front is gonna you know give you a pretty high cost right there. So LADWP currently that Rich you know developing years ago, and we kind of do away with fixed charge. We embed all the fixed charge into all the you know the water you know HCF, all the power energy charge that we just the more you use you get a more part of the fixed charge. So that's the way we try to solve that you know. Whether you use how much, then you're going to be, you know, the lower you use, the higher you pay. So now our systems, more you use, more you pay, and that's very, you know, straightforward. But there's also issue with that. Now the revenue for the department, the utility, it's going to be very, you know, variable. One year it's going to be high because of draw, you know, the other, you know, low. The other 1 year is a wet year, and then all of a sudden we don't have a guaranteed income stream. So there's got to be a balance that we see it. You know, you have to have some fixed charge up front maybe, but you have to have some, you know, also the very, you know, the conservation, you know, signals that the less you use, you know, the less you pay. So there's a balance there. We try to fix that, and we have not, you know, find the, you know, the optimum, you know, point yet. But that's the point that we try to reach, and you know, when we design the rates.
I'll just add, you know, one point to that. The California Urban Water Conservation Council in the last year has developed and you know promulgated a best management practice for how much of the revenue should be recovered through fixed charges versus the variable commodity charges.
Let me just add a wrinkle to water pricing, which is that, particularly for residential use, is that we need to, and this is a public health issue in developing countries, we need to account not only for the cost of getting water into the house, but the cost of treating the water as it leaves. And in developing countries, this is a very low priority because, of course, you know, for obvious reasons, it's not as urgent. But clearly, it's part of the package. And in the modern countries, we're very sophisticated, and we can monitor both of these separately and price accordingly. But in developing countries, the notion of somehow reflecting not only the cost of distribution, but the cost of treatment afterward is proved to be very thorny. And if you see the level to which people are getting access to water in the slums of developing countries, even when those numbers are going up, usually the treatment of sewage and appreciation for the cost of dealing with that is not keeping up with that because politically, it's just it's more problematic to get people to appreciate that part of the problem.
I would add, going back to the ideal pricing structure, I would include some provision for free water for the poorest, for the most destitute households, because there are households where people are disabled or elderly, or there's no income coming in, and in developing countries there's no social safety net except for the family, and even in those cases, the extended family may not be available. So there are literally houses that cannot pay for water. But that maybe it would be tied to some basic minimum amount, quantity that's needed for survival that would be free. Then a progressive tariff based on ability to pay that would get more, the tariff would also get higher with the more you used, so more water you consume. And there is a model for this in Senegal. They've privatized their water system. SONES, the French water agency, came in and they set up this dissuasive tariff structure where the more you consume, the higher the rate. But initially they bypassed the poorest communities because they couldn't figure out a way to deliver water to these very poor areas that couldn't afford it. So an NGO came in, INDA, an international NGO, partnered with local groups and set up community pipe stands and developed a community pricing model. Now initially what happened is, because you have many people using the same water point, they became the highest rate users, right? Because they're consuming more. So each of these individual units became. So it was through a lot of advocacy from the NGO to get the SONES to reduce the rates for these to treat these community water stands differently than individual household connections. So it always goes back to recognizing differential ability or ability to pay or affordability and having to build that into your pricing model. The second thing I want to add to that is it's not only the price itself, but how you charge. So, for example, Dale Whittington did a study on willingness to pay in rural parts of Nigeria, and they found that people didn't want to pay a fixed monthly rate to the water agency. Firstly, because the quality of the municipal water was spotty, and they didn't want to prepay for water that they weren't sure they were going to get. But also, poor households where you're sourcing money on a daily basis, where maybe, in a developing country, 2/3 are earning money in the informal economy through trading and day-to-day. There's not an income, a salary, paying into a pension and all of that. So people's money varies by day. So they need a way to control, the poorest households need a way to control their cash flow. So they rather pay on a as needed basis than a monthly. So you also have to build in how to pay as well as the price and then ensure equity in pricing.
Sure. I wanted to raise an issue about equity that I think is often missed, and it applies in this country. Many local governments right now are raising their water rates. And that's causing the most able customers to invest in conservation, in-house and outdoor water use reductions. Water efficiency, though, is an equity issue because poor households that rent are not going to be able to enjoy the cost savings associated with those investments. And I think this, and especially in Los Angeles, this is a huge issue because if your water bill is going up 30% per unit consumed, and you have and everyone else around you, the middle and upper income, the businesses are able to invest in water conservation and efficiency, and you're not, your bill is going to go up more than it needs, and your ability to respond to higher prices is going to come only through restrictions in the quantities you consume and not in efficiencies in terms of low-flow toilets and the whole list of things that can be undertaken. So I think there's actually a public policy problem here in Los Angeles and across the country as water rates go up, which is how lower-income households can benefit from efficiency programs and conservation programs when they actually don't control the home they live in. They don't control the appliances, the sprinkling systems, things like that.
Well, along those lines, it seems to me that in the case of food and trying to make sure that people at the lower end of the economic scale have marginally at least enough money to eat, we haven't tried to do that by controlling the price of food. We've given people food stamps, which is a supplement to, I guess you would say, the neediest parts of society. I'm wondering are you aware of in practice or even in theory, is it possible to do a water stamp kind of program where people could get chits to, as you say, kind of, they can't take advantage of savings where they are, but perhaps if they had a chit to buy down that initial cost of the water. Is anybody aware of if that's being done?
I'm not aware of any of a program like food stamps, but I would like to point out in LA, and this is of course true around the country, that low-income customers who live as tenants in apartment buildings, the water service is typically master metered and passed on through the rents. We've addressed this to the extent that we've found a way to address this in Los Angeles by offering to low-income customers who are not water customers of record, but who are electric customers of record, a discount on their electric bill as low-income for the water. And the idea there being that if that discount were provided to the landlord, it would be less likely to be passed on to the tenant. What the landlords are struggling with is how do they incentivize their tenants to pay more attention to the water conservation. And that remains an issue and a concern. We've tried to address that with information campaign, pamphlets that can be handed to tenants and so forth. We do allow for sub-metering in Los Angeles, so long as the price is not more than what we charge to the landlord directly. And there are cases, where landlords have found a way to do it. When you're into a rent control situation, it becomes a little more complicated. So, this is a public policy question still, and how to best address it.
I just wanted to turn it around a little bit and make a couple more comments about really how complicated the notion of pricing is for the poor in developing countries. But I'm not familiar with a food stamp kind of program for water, but where we are familiar with is the opposite case, where different kinds of commodities are subsidized to help the poor. And it's very obvious that that's a very crude targeting method, such as, in Mexico, tortillas had been subsidized for a very long time, and then construction materials. But we found that it was the large construction conglomerates that were really benefiting from the program more than others. But just a couple of comments about how really, the notion of the right price, particularly for the poor in developing countries, is such a nuanced and multidimensional issue. There are a number of aspects to this. As Charisma just mentioned, budgeting is a huge issue for the poor. And we also have found in different studies that they really are not keen on this notion of getting a regular bill because of the problems of budgeting for that. But the alternative is a little bit unclear how they would do that. So it's just managing, sort of understanding the household budget situation is a huge issue. Part of that is sometimes some problems with corruption, or what we would call corruption. We were talking before we started formally this morning about an instance when I was in Jakarta, and there was a rumor that for households to pay to get their house connected to the pipe water system, which of course would be very advantageous to them from a financial point of view, since the water is so much cheaper that way, that they had to pay a bribe to the local utility. And so I asked a local NGO director if that was true, and he seemed a little put off by this question, so I figured I'd cross some cultural line, and after a pause he said, well, there's no bribes, but there is this unofficial fee you can pay that facilitates the whole process. And as I mentioned in class, we talk about that a little bit, about the cultural notion of what is a bribe and what is corruption and what is instead just a tip or something. And it makes the pricing thing kind of complicated, because you've got a number of different places to pay. Oh, and I guess another point was that in addition, part of the price that the poor often pay is their labor in getting water to the house. So sometimes a very useful mechanism for starting to broaden the distribution of public water to the poor is to, as an intermediary stage, have public taps or hydrants that people can go to locally and get water and bring it to their houses. Sometimes they can do it with hoses, but a lot of times they have to carry it or use carts. And it's time consuming, and it's heavy. They can send children once they're old You can just see this notion of what the right price would be is a very rich one that's very location specific and very hard to kind of nail down in terms of how to properly manage that mix.
I also haven't seen that exact model, but in Lagos, they're actually beginning to introduce prepaid water metering. They've started to introduce prepaid metering for electricity. Right now, they're starting with single-family households in more of the wealthier areas of the metropolitan area. But the idea is they would like to spread that, which is worrisome on one hand if as has been in the case if they don't take into account the ability of people to pay these prepaid through these prepaid systems. On the other hand, it could introduce the possibility of providing some kind of subsidies for households to, use prepaid tokens to get water. But the state would have to recognize that. But so possibly through metering, which is being introduced now, that could be done.
Can I come back to the issue of water meters? Because I think that's tremendously important. You can't price water effectively unless you meter water. And in California, we are, as was pointed out, I think the sort of conventional wisdom is for multifamily apartments, there's no metering of individual consumption. But that's changing, and Sacramento and other municipalities are beginning to require metering of new construction. And does LA require that for new buildings?
It's not required. We're working with developers, to make that possible, but it isn't yet a requirement in LA. And there are problems, to be worked out, from.
But I think we're working with mayor's office. Mayor being very energy and water conservation. He's leading that area. So with the new housing, and we are testing those new meters. And I'm in charge of the metering project in Department 2. So we're putting new meters that you don't have to go into the homes to read it. You can read it from the street. And with the radio frequency, you can pick up the information. So in the future, yes, we're gonna develop some metering technology. That the technology is already there, and it's not that costly, and we can do it. Just retrofitting those apartments and get it in there, and that takes some time and sauce.
So I want to make the point that if you're interested in equity in water consumption and pricing in Los Angeles, we ought to be pushing for more metering, because we're not going to get there. Everyone's water bills are higher now in an apartment building because of the average cost pricing. It gets built into rents. People think the landlord pays it. The landlord doesn't pay it. The tenants pay it, and they pay it in an average cost increment of their rent. So if we're really interested in both managing the environmental impacts, sending the right price signals, and social equity in pricing, we've got a price based on individual meter consumption. And all it requires is changing our building codes. I mean, it's true DWP would adjust, but they've got the capacity to do that seamlessly now with the technologies that we have.
I want to get back to a point that came up, and it had to, I think it had to do with what I'll euphemistically call the cash cow principle of water utilities. I had the opportunity to review a proposal a little while back. The city of Milwaukee was proposing to lease or put a private concession out for operation of the Milwaukee water utility under the assumption that they could get a large upfront cash payment, which then they could turn into an endowment, which then they could use to buy down other pending budget shortfalls they have, everything from pensions to everything else. And of course, the idea was attacked on water provision shouldn't be private, the Milwaukee utility's public. But I thought it was flawed more on the idea that now we're moving the general burden of municipal operations onto a much smaller group, the water rate payers. And certainly this has been an issue here recently, that there's been fights over increasing utility rates, and there's been no discussion of reducing the payment that's supposed to flow from the utility, both from the water side and the electric side. I would ask the group, how prevalent is this sort of, I guess in Randy's terms, maybe this is a government-to-government fee that's paid to facilitate things. This idea of using the utility as something of a cash cow to buy down other costs.
From LA Department of Water and Power, water system, we don't transfer any money to the city. That's because the law also, being implemented in California that no public utility can transfer any more money from the water operation. So the water system stopped transfer, I think a couple years ago. So we have not paid anything over to the city. On the electrical side, yes, we do have a transfer. And what we see is part of the city investment because over the private sector that they pay the dividends to the stockholders, and city buying have us operating here, and we are contributing to the service. There's a difference that if you pay the dividends to the stockholders and they're gonna use for any way they like to use, but for the transfers that actually we provided the service to the city, the firemen and the police department. Majority of funding is coming from Department of Water Power, the power transfer funds. So we probably, I forgot exactly the number, but over 50% contributions from the operation from us. And in turn, we put money back into the city so that, keep the city going. So there's some trade-off there. So that's the public power. We love to do this, and we want to make sure the city is, growing stronger. And with all these, our proceeds. So, and our rates still lower than the IOUs, the Edisons and the PG&Es by operating efficiently, and at the same time we continue to try to support the city.
Well, I think in developing countries, and you'd be surprised how often in this country the transfer doesn't come from the city to the utility, but it goes from the utility to the city. And especially in developing countries, it's one of the #1 reasons for fraud and abuse and the argument for privatization. And we haven't really spoken to this issue, but one of the reasons people don't want to prepay for water in developing countries is because they don't think they'll get it. There's a tremendous amount of distrust. The government has promised improvements, and every day things get worse from the household's perspective. So the World Bank, who's been in this business 30 or 40 years, has finally learned that you start with a pilot project in a neighborhood and you prove to that community that you can deliver. And only then do you launch a full-scale initiative to try and improve service, because without people committing and being willing to pay, you're not going to get the upgrades you need. So I think, and the other dimension to the relationship between the utility and the cities arise when there are municipal elections and city councilmen want to use the municipal labor unions to get out the vote. And so you get, once you get the mixing of the municipal politics with the utility politics, it's almost invariably bad for customers.
Let me say a couple of things about water governance as part of this issue. And I guess I just want to make a couple of points. One is that the administering agency comes in many, many different forms. Even in California, we have completely private water companies that I think in some cases might own the infrastructure, which is kind of the way people think about privatization. In more cases, we have around the world private companies that really only have management responsibilities, so they're contracted with the government to administer the public facilities, which introduces a little bit of competition because this contract comes up for reevaluation every few years. And a good example of one way to do that right, I think, is Mexico City, which divided the city into 4 different districts, each with a different private management company that would then be competing with each other again in 7 years to do that. So much better than the way we do cable TV, for example, in this country, where we just let one company own the system, and there's really nobody else that can replace them later. And then we have different ways of doing it publicly. And in California, we have city departments, but that's actually quite rare. It's only the older cities of the state that have municipal departments that are in charge of water. Most of the rest of the state is governed by completely independent governments with separately elected boards that are elected by the users, the residents. And I'll just say something about that, a really quick anecdote, which is that a colleague of mine, when I taught at Irvine, who was a water scientist and had been on the water board there, the Irvine Ranch Water District, which is a very important water district internationally, actually. She moved out of town to Rancho Santa Margarita and ran for the board there. There were 3 positions, and she came in 3rd and won. So this is announced that she had won the election, and a single individual protested, saying, "I didn't vote for her. I do not understand how she won." So that was the kind of story you want to read a little bit more of. But not only that, he was right. They had miscounted his vote, and so she lost. So you're trying to figure out what's going on, and it turned out in Rancho Santa Margarita, which largely urbanized at the time, it was still based on the old ranch model of water governance, where the number of votes you got was explained by how much land you owned. And this guy had hundreds of thousands of votes. And he knew he hadn't voted for her, and he didn't see how she won, and in fact, they had miscounted, so she lost. But of course, the users got all upset. They didn't realize at some level that that was the way it was, and they switched it later to a one-person, one-vote system. But the way in which these are managed differently have very different implications for the political structure and the political will to price. And to charge accordingly, because it does become a political volleyball in some cases, or in the case of the independent governments, which are basically invisible, because they're so low profile unless there's a problem, so they're governed by people that never leave office. You can talk about a democratic system being accountable, but it's in an invisible government, it's very hard to make that argument. So that's just a point to layer on top of all of this, which is the way these things are managed is very different, which has implications for the political economy of pricing.
Can I add to that as well? Maybe the flip side, when water utilities are not a cash cow, there was a time in Nigeria where public utilities were converted to parastatals to enable them to qualify for international loans, and that was used as a way during the military regime to bring in foreign currency, which was mismanaged. Now they are attempting in Lagos in particular to privatize the water sector in a model. Sounds kind of similar to the Mexico model, where you would turn the state into districts and different water companies would manage different districts. And so the World Bank has actually recently stepped in with an IDA loan. And so there was a rush to convert the public water utility into a private asset holding company in order to qualify for this money. And there's a lot of debate in civil society in terms of, where's this money going and all of that. So kind of in unofficial ways, you see water being a cash cow. But the other side of it is the intergovernmental aspect. To what extent is the water utility prioritized by other parts of government? Speaking to water utilities in Benin City, for example, you go to the water treatment works, you see a warehouse that should be full of chlorine and all the chemicals to treat the water, only a quarter full. The fuel that they would need to run the generators, because the electricity is always cutting out, which affects the pumps that pump to the rest of the city. There's no fuel because the state won't allocate money to purchase fuel. So it's also, what strength or, within the government does the water utility have in order to even advocate for its own operations or for its users is a big issue.
I would add, one other point, when you are customer owned, there is a greater opportunity for public involvement in setting policy, and particularly for the issues that affect the local area. We do have public policy, of course, being set at the state level. It could be at the county level, but when it's customer owned, there's that stronger connection there.
Well, I want to challenge that just a little bit. Because even when agencies are either publicly owned or publicly managed, the presumption is that they're going to be, even when the agencies are privately owned or privately managed, there's a strong presumption that these will be publicly regulated, because they are in many cases local monopolies and as such. So, you know, in principle, you could think that users would have as much access to accountability mechanisms as when they're either owned by the city or their local independent governments. But again, in practice, which is what we really care about, it just varies so much that it's hard to know what the accountability mechanisms are. And just another kind of quirky example, which I think Jeremy may know more about, is the city of San Francisco, which actually is primarily a wholesale distributor of water to the rest of a good part of the rest of the Bay Area, and there is no accountability mechanism for those users that exists under law, because there is no agency that has authority over the city of San Francisco and the way in which they sell water or distribute water to their users. Nobody in San Mateo votes for anybody in San Francisco, so there just isn't that normal mechanism. So you know, there's this notion that public is always better than private in democratic systems, but I think you really have to look at the details to see what's going on and the extent to which. I mean, it may be mostly true and maybe largely true, but I think, you know, you can't say that that's such as a blanket statement.
Well, that's another good segue. I've done a little bit of work on looking at, you know, what happened in the water business as a lot of these state-owned enterprises transitioned, and I think mainly and often because of human capacity issues, what I'll broadly call privatization in the developing world seems to be more of a model. And this can run everywhere from ownership to operating concessions. We're seeing more of that, I think, in the U.S. Again, there's certainly a very active private water industry that would like to come in, not so much to own, but to operate and manage. Pluses and minuses on both sides. Do you see private involvement as a barrier to some of these social equity issues we're talking about, necessarily?
I would say, oh, I'm sorry. I would say not necessarily. I think the key point, which is what Randy was also just mentioning, is the governance, the accountability. You can have the private sector involved. In many ways, people would welcome, because of the history of the state not providing services, they welcome the private sector involvement in delivery of services, but it's about the regulation and the governance. Even in the UK, where initially when water was privatized, there were a high number of cutoffs, water shutoffs. But once the once regulation kicked in, then you actually have a lower number of cutoffs than before privatization happened. So you see that around the world, different models where private sector involvement can improve services, but you need strong government. It doesn't mean the government steps out of delivering services. They may play a more important role in terms of regulating and equity and accountability and so forth.
I would also say not necessarily at all. It can go either way. I mean, bringing the private sector in is often seen as a way to bring in new capital for investment. There was a lot of interest on the part of international consortiums, of which there are many, well, not as many as there used to be, because there's been a lot of consolidation, but to come into developing countries in particular as a way, really win-win situations, which turn out not to work out as well as they thought. And my source on this is really just The Economist, so maybe people will know about individual instances, but these consortiums have come in and provided capital, provided management experience, but have found that there wasn't the political will locally to support the rates that would then finance the system. So they're actually retreating in many cases from these developing country markets because their revenue side is just is still a political obstacle. Of course, we're also aware of cases where the private sector has come in and for various reasons has bungled things, or there were efforts to just corruption and so forth. Cochabamba is probably the one that most people are most familiar with, where I think it was Bechtel that came in. There was an announcement one day that all the wells belonged to this company from now on, and even private wells were going to be priced, and there was some misinformation and so forth, and there were riots and people died, and it was turned into a very violent situation. So there was probably the private sector didn't didn't participate quite, or wasn't monitored as well in that cases. But in principle, there's no reason that it should interfere with social equity goals, because again, it should be, in almost all of these instances, the case that there's some regulatory authority that has a say about that.
Well, I'll pass for the moment. Do you guys have anything to say about that?
You know, we are in the public sector, so obviously we always have a little bit bias on the public, especially for these, you know, scarce resource like water, like power, and takes a lot of capital to build. And we can't have two water, you know, system, you know, supply the city, you know, privately, you know, to compete against each other, and you know, that's wasteful of resource. So. In this case, that, you know, I think there's a strong case for public, you know, involvement in this, you know, the power and the water delivery. I think it's probably better off. And you look at how much participation you involve in our operation and versus the private-owned company, that you see the rates going up on the other side, that you don't even hear anything. Anything we do here, every 5%, 3%, the newspaper all over us. So, you know, so many layers of, you know, people, you know, watch over us. We have to be efficient, and we have to, you know, do a better job. So, you know, every time I step in front of, you know, the gas pump, I said, whoa, it's another 50 cents, you know, increase. Nobody can say anything. I can't even complain to anybody. But, you know, we increase a couple cents on the water or power, you know, that's, you know, we're going to hear this for days and months, you know. And so, you know, for this basic needs, you know, the resource staff, yeah, I think, you know, public has could be a, you know, major role, and to make sure the price is, you know, equitable and you know, take care of the community. So that's our view on that.
Before we move on to some questions from the audience, I guess I'd just kind of like to try to do a sort of partial wrap-up question here. We've talked about a lot of issues, and barriers always come up, but I guess the question I'd put to the panel is now, you know, what would be your view to sort of overcoming the barriers we discussed, and if you could be in charge for 15 minutes, what would be the system that you'd put in place? Don't take 15 minutes to describe it, but just if we could go through the panelists to kind of, we've identified the barriers, where would you like to see us in a better place on this issue?
Just go down.
Just go down.
Well, I guess that goes back to the ideal question, what an ideal water system would look like. But definitely it has to, I think community users have to, and community members have to be involved in understanding the pricing and management of water. I think you have to take into account, there are a lot of things we didn't say, the quality of services. While the public sector ideally would be the one, I think, providing basic services, the fact is that when the quality of the service provided by the public sector is not high, people turn elsewhere or create the services themselves. And so part of the equity question of pricing, we have to take into account the quality of services. So is water available? Is it located close to where people live? You know, does it come directly into their homes or into their plots or into their communities? And how do people value that differently in terms of what they would be willing to pay for it? Is it reliable? Does it flow 24 hours a day or only spottily? And can you give people a set time of day when they can expect water, or, you know, when it's unpredictable? That also affects what they're willing to pay. You know, the quality, is it safe? Is it actually potable? You have public utilities providing water in many developing countries, but the pipes, the quality is not good. And so people are not willing to pay for, they actually distrust the piped water more than groundwater supplied by vendors. So there's a lot of other dimensions that have to be factored in to pricing water services that has a lot to do with quality and the perceptions of community members and users themselves.
Well, those are all really good points, and I guess I might add that when we're talking about, you know, if taking over a system and changing it, that it depends on where you are, and what we're concerned about in that case is the directions of reform. So of course we want everything to be better, but in some cases that might mean, for the example, for the poor and developing countries to start charging them for publicly available water. Although ideally we might like to get to a position where we're giving it to them for free or have very, very low lifeline rates. So I mean, you know, in some cases we're talking about people that are so poor that paying any amount for water really squeezes the rest of their household budget. But in the interim, you might just want to be moving toward that direction in order to have enough finances to deal with some of the quality issues that Charisma mentioned. And I'll just mention another example of that in terms of, because, you know, usually when we're talking about water and the poor and developing countries, we're not talking about costs, we're talking about the quality of the water itself and whether it has diseases in it or viruses or bacteria or whatever. And that's a huge issue, it turns out, also for cost, because in many parts of the world, the poor have to boil their water. And in some instances, fuel is inexpensive, but I remember there was a cholera epidemic in South America a few years ago, and the president just announced that everybody should boil their water for 20 minutes. And the fuel situation was such that that represented 30% of the typical household budget. You know, it just wasn't realistic, but indeed that's part of the cost. So I would say we want to move in a direction where we have sufficient revenues to provide better water, and that ultimately we might have the goal of a more ideal system where we can underwrite those costs for the poor.
Well, I would just kind of recap, I think, what we've talked about, which is we need all water metered per customer. An increasing block tariff that covers the utilities' revenue needs are important. I think it's also, though, important to realize that as we push towards conservation, either in response to price signals or improved efficiency, it's going to threaten the utilities' revenues, whether it's privately owned or publicly owned, in terms of covering their fixed costs. So adjustments and a public awareness of that's important. The one issue we haven't talked at all about is the fact that urban consumers, we've been so focused on poor consumers, but urban consumers spend somewhere between 10 and 20 times and pay 10 to 20 times on average more than a rural farmer would for the same amount of water. It's a different quality, but in every country in the world just about, with the exception of maybe Israel right now, 70% of all the water is used by agricultural consumption to produce crops, produce products, you know, to support economic development. Historically, water was the primary tool for economic development. One of the biggest things that we could do now that would help the poor would be to allow transfers, work on our policy barriers to allow transfers, voluntary transfers between the agricultural sector and the urban sector. It would reduce the cost of water and allow it to be put to more beneficial uses for society.
Yeah, I think this is this setting is very helpful for us. We like to really going out to the community, learn different ideas from everybody, and we can do a better job to serve the area. In the past, yes, we kind of more self-sustain, and more now we more and more open up to the public, and we have a neighborhood councils. We talk to the community, and now we talk to the schools and get some new ideas, fresh ideas to help us to really do a better job. I think this is great. We enjoy this, and in fact, you heard, saw the newspaper. We've been, a lot of race action. Even last night, we had some, the passage going on. So, but we take the time. We come here. We say, well, this is a great opportunity for us to, listen to other people's ideas, and how can we improve? We don't have an unlimited amount of resource, the funding, but yet we want to do, as best job we can, and to deliver the safe, high quality water to the city. That's our goal.
I think our last point here is that we have a sustainable source of water supply, and that we meet future demand through a combination of conservation and recycling, and that we reduce our dependence on imported water. I think those are the direction our department is set, and then the education of our customers so that they know better what choices they can make and what technologies they can use to reduce their use of water or improve their efficient use of water and reduce their bills, hopefully.
Okay, we've got some time, and we'd like to take questions or comments, although comments do not include speeches. If you give a speech, we'll have you removed. But we would like questions and comments. First there and then here. Yes, sir. Please state your name when you...
Luis Rodriguez, Senior Planner, working on the Jordan Downs redevelopment. So my question is for DWP. Would you consider in the future offering reduced rates or rebates for projects that would meet LEED certification, like implementing great water system, xeriscape, hardscape, landscape, bioswale, you know, lower usage of water, low flushing toilets. Do you offer those types of incentives or rebates?
Well, we offer rebates for those programs, but you know, with regard to the rates themselves, you know, the LEED certification really, you know, there's some in that about water, but I think we need to look to a step further about you know, developing with the best practices. There are a number of areas where that can be done, but yes, I mean, to answer the question on the rates, particularly with the tiered pricing, there are ways to, you know, introduce that as a factor. A certification, because you know, we had thought about that with the, you know, current situation we're in now with the I don't want to call it water rationing, but our drought pricing that we have currently, that would be desirable if we could incorporate that idea that you're speaking of here into the drought pricing.
Sounds like, I like the gentleman's idea of individual metering, but it also sounds like an upfront cost issue as well. I mean, when you're looking at 1,600 units to individual meter each one of those.
Meters they don't cost that much.
Okay, but if we implement something like that, you know, maybe DWP can take a look at reducing rates.
Well, I mean, as a demand-side management kind of program, yes. I mean, the concept's very good. You know, how do we work it out? You know, the practical issues, and particularly, you know, where a building's being retrofitted, how best to do that. We need to work together on that.
I might contact George.
Okay. Over here.
Hi, my name is Alex May. I'm here from America. Thank you for everyone taking the time. It's really interesting to hear a perspective about what the rest of the world is like. Because we often think that, you know, Los Angeles is everything there is. So very eye-opening. But in an urban setting, and as a political deputy, we hear loud and clear from residents in LA. And the issue of equity often is not about such serious things as life and death, and you know, you're going to get cholera from your water. People in LA tend to group their lawn in with their house as something that they're entitled to. And the idea that everyone in LA is entitled to water their lawn and their landscape, I think people here see that as an equity issue. And so as we move towards stricter conservation and higher tier block pricing to encourage conservation, how do we separate out these kind of essential uses, water for sanitation and cooking, from the non-essential decorative uses for landscape irrigation, so that we're not making everybody pay a higher rate for, you know, somebody to build a nice green lawn?
Well, a couple of ideas. One, make having a xeriscape landscape a social virtue. I think is one thing that needs to happen, and that's public education. That's changing values. Start with your kindergartners, and they'll remind you frequently that this is important, I think. Second thing, make it less costly to convert lawns to xeriscape. Like in allowing 8811 funds, which is a revolving fund that households may in the county have access to, which would let you take out loans to undertake currently energy efficiency or solar investments at a fairly low interest rate. So that would be one thing. I think the second thing kind of piggybacks on the third thing piggybacks on the first, which is as rates go up, remind people what they can do and show them how much their lawn is costing them. every month. I mean, I live in Pasadena. I get billed every 2 months, and it's hundreds of dollars if you have a reasonably sized lawn. It's ridiculous. And so letting people know what the options are, I think, is one. But I'm sure there are lots of other things, too.
Well, I just want to mention that ultimately, one way we think about approaching that is to have separate sources of water for these different uses. And what you see, I live in Irvine, and the Irvine Ranch Water District has a very nice program of having a substantial sources of recycled water available for particularly public landscaping areas. So this is a little bit different from metering because you do need 2 sets of pipes, but they've also done that in Irvine for the newer skyscrapers and so forth. They use gray water, so-called gray water, recycled water for the toilets and other plumbing. So, you know, this is a more idealistic notion of where we might go, but when you're redeveloping and so forth, there are some cost advantages to actually having dual pipe systems in these different settings to sort of show that you can use water with different costs for different uses.
You know, one of the things in answer to that, I actually undertook a zero-scape front lawn, not voluntarily. I was forced into it. And given the fact that my wife is a bit of a lunatic and these kinds of things, we probably spent a little more than people need to. But the fact of the matter is that you can drastically reduce water consumption for this. And, you know, I don't know that I've got enough time left on the planet to fully amortize the investment, but the fact of the matter is water use is way down. And I think if this was more publicized, that people could do this on an individual basis. You know, we actually did this because we had a big dead spot in the middle of the lawn that we just couldn't get to grow, so we spent $10,000 to fix it. But the fact of the matter is we have reduced water use substantially, and I think if people were aware that there were things they could do, and I know some of the water agencies are really pretty good with this. I know DWP is, and I know Met, but having the information available and having it readily available to people, I think, are two different things. And I think if there was more promotion on this, people might see that you don't need, there are alternatives to lots of grass that not only make more sense, but can save you money. And again, tying it in with this 811 program, there's a bill that Jared Huffman, I believe, is going to introduce in the legislature that would make those kinds of loans available. And I think key to that is financing. So coupling a good idea with a way to get it done would be a really good thing to do. Over here and then here.
I'm from UCLA. Just to follow up on that point, I think you need to think about it. Orange County, I know there's an issue that home actually got sued because they tore up their lawn. So, you know, just make sure that our policies are actually making sort of zero-scaping allowable. But my question is, I think, something that's going to kind of go through the whole conference in terms of, you know, thinking about in water policy, we're starting to reform our kind of pricing structure that maybe it's even below these fixed costs. People might see that, you know, if we can get it so it's more allowable and has maybe 10% costs. I think the pushback that we see is kind of socializing of water pricing and how to kind of get against that, you know, that make sure that people don't perceive as the higher use customers are subsidizing the lower customers, and how to kind of politically think about that.
Of course, it's amusing. Very often we have problems with that, but we don't seem to have problems with lower income customers subsidizing higher income customers. You know, but I'll just throw that out. The panel have anything to add on that?
Well, I would point again to the idea of marginal cost. You know, what is the true cost of water? What is the true cost of developing new sources? And you know, to have price signals that are appropriate. Then on the last point on, you know, the zero-scape, I think the language we use is really important here, and the term California-friendly or native landscape has a lot more appeal to people, I think, than zero-scape. And really, these landscapes are very attractive, but to be able to show and demonstrate to customers and to change the perception and community, develop this as a community value, that, you know, it's a whole new world of choice in landscape, you know, the kinds of plants, learning, you know, what these plants are, and just becoming attached to them. The more you look at these low water use plants, I think, the more attractive and appealing they are. So, you know, we want this to be something that the customers enjoy and that they value, and that has a benefit to the environment, and would reduce their use of water and reduce their bills.
Over here.
My name is Dennis Erdman, Senate Valley Water District. I'd like to know some guidelines for definition of lifeline, quantities, and how do you make determinations on what lifeline quantities are?
Well, I think I'm not going to be able to give you a specific answer for your district, and I think that's because developing lifeline rates and quantities requires looking at how water is used by households and identifying what one would consider the really essential uses of that water. It's going to vary across California. It's certainly going to vary across the country. I don't know right off the top of my head what would be considered a reasonable lifeline quantity per month and what the rate should be. I mean, it's a balancing of both how the water is used and then also what's affordable. And their definitions of affordability tend to range between 3 to 5% of income in this country. So that's often what Congress refers to when it's looking at the Safe Drinking Water Act and how much can regulations push up the price of water. But then there's the financial viability of the utility to consider. So, you know, that's the third element.
Probably in terms of quantity of water, what you see more frequently is in the range of 7 to 9, we call billing units, 100 cubic feet. 100 cubic feet is 748 gallons per month. So there's the quantity approach there of you know, just basic need, to meet basic needs. There are some standards being developed here in the state we're looking at for you know, per capita use of water, and you know that's important. When we implemented the lifeline rates in Los Angeles some years ago, with extending that to power customers, who are not water customers of record, to have a credit on their bill where their individual use is not metered, the decision was made to go to a credit. So we have a $1 credit, $10 a month for lifeline, low income, $5 a month for 3 persons in the household, up to $10 per month for additional people, $1 for each additional person in the household. So that's another approach that could be used.
I'd just add, for those who are thinking about this in terms of developing countries, that it's like relative poverty. You know, it depends on the level of wealth and what is the basic minimum basket of goods or things that people need to do in different countries. A lot of developing countries, people talk about the minimum amounts of water you need to survive. Like, I think those are what feeds into South Africa's lifeline tariffs. You know, something like 20 liters a day for all uses and 3 liters for drinking water, which is like bare minimum survival standards of water. But it's going to vary by what's acceptable in given countries, I think.
Michael?
Michael Keston, I have a question. When you look at dollars that are available for poorer people to spend in their household income, we know here in Los Angeles, many people go out and buy bottled water. I know the LA Department of Water and Power 6 or 7 years ago did a study of 30 or 40 different private water bottling operations and found that the DWP water was cleaner, sweeter than 90% of these Arrowhead and other things that are being bottled, as well as the quality of the water. There was an issue about the taste, but the quality was the highest. LADWP doesn't go out, I would think, to communities and tell them you ought to be drinking tap water, because that's the cheapest thing that you could do, and it's good water, and it's fine water, and it's healthy water. And I think that's a major step. And one of the problems with all of these utilities, when you get the bill, you get a bill and you get 5 or 6 things in there, and they're very small letters, and I throw them out, and I look at the bill. Okay? So if you want to get that kind of a message out, perhaps what you need to do is send a separate letter or something to people that, you know, maybe talk about how good and clean water is and how it should be used for drinking water. And I know drinking water is a very low percentage of the water used by LADWP. What is it, 60 or 70% is landscaping? And that's total water use.
Right.
So
Yeah.
that's the one you got to work on. But this one will help the people who can't afford it. So I'd like to hear your comments on that.
Well, your points are well made. We do have, you know, some outreach on that subject. Water is safe. Our water is safe to drink. One of the issues you do get into for individual users is their household plumbing, their individual household plumbing, and you know that may be one reason some of our customers, you know, choose the bottled water because the pipes are rusty or have issues like that. And we did have a pilot program, and I can't tell you the status or result from it, for point of use treatment, you know, water filter within the house, where we could help with that. There's some challenges there, but you know, it's something that we were looking at seriously there. But you're absolutely right. I mean, you know, for customers who go out and purchase water for drinking, it's much more expensive. And
you know, just from the the cost, you know, you buy a bottle of water $1, you know, from any market, and our water is like 1 penny for 2 gallon water. So that's our price, and so it's very safe water. But you know, we need to do better education, you know, reach out the community that's the water, you know, it's safer and much cheaper.
Let me just add that at least until very recently, tap water was much more regulated than bottled water. So this is an issue that just really isn't very well understood. And I'm told that the bottles are not designed to store water for a long period of time because the plastic actually leaches into the water. They're really designed for short-term use, but people put them aside for earthquakes or whatever. And people don't really understand these things. And I've been in other cases with public utilities where a local a company that wants to sell water to people will start advertising about the problems with the public water supply. And of course, the public utilities get very upset about this because it's false advertising. But there isn't really much marketing on the part of the public utilities, in particular, to offset that. And so, I mean, I suppose it's an internal matter, but I think that you're probably quite right that people still don't realize that in some cases the bottled water is tap water from Riverside County. And of course the city of LA gets a good amount of its water from pristine Sierra sources, which is a whole nother story. But I think there are some public marketing issues there that need to be addressed.
Please.
Just a tangential point that bottled water is also big in developing countries as well, ironically. And you have the same issue where people, like in Nigeria, are re-bottling state water or worse quality water and selling it. But a lot of that is what's already been mentioned, the public relations and the perception of water on the part of the consumer. But it's big business all over the world.
Got time for one more question right here, please.
I question the economics of metering apartment for water. My sense is that apartment users use a lot less water than you use with your big water. So
It's actually a little.
I have a big water. I only use part of the water. So is there a benefit cost now?
Lots of them. There are lots of them. Yeah. It pencils out. I mean, I can show you the models. There's no question that over a 3-year period, it would save apartment owners if they could internalize the savings.
I would add one point to that too, which is it's not just the cost of the water, but the cost of the sewer service fees associated with the water.
Okay, we have time for one more question. Be brief.
Mark, USC, question for Teresa. Do you have knowledge of micro financing strategies that are now operating in developing countries for water basic necessity? Do you have understanding what you see the future of that approach to addressing the water as opposed to the more corporate middle economy?
Thank you. I really appreciate that question. I think there's a lot of future in that model. Already informal vendors are the ones who are serving the poorest customers by amassing their own resources and buying pipes and hiring engineers to connect to the water mains or to dig deep wells or boreholes to serve different areas. Oftentimes these vendors are informal and don't have access to official sources of capital, and that's what makes the end cost to the user be 100 to 200 times more expensive than public water. One example that I know where this is working is in Ahmedabad in India, where you have community members put in some money, you had local private sector put in some money, and the government put in a little bit more money. So you had 3 sources of money, and then microloans were available to community. And these are not only for water supply, but for sewerage projects and drainage projects. And it's actually making a difference in terms of people are able to earn some income from water by institutionalizing this delivery of service at a very micro level, and it's having some health benefits. So I think while the public, both the state and large private sector are having a difficult time figuring out how to deliver water to the poorest of households, there's a lot of potential in going micro with it if we can institutionalize and formalize people who are already delivering water to these poorest households and making them part of official systems. And we can even start to regulate the quality of water that comes through these other alternative systems, I think.
So we have a micro solution to a maxi problem. And with that, why don't we all thank our panelists for wonderful